All right, cool. So I'm just gonna give everyone a short bio of who you actually are and what an incredible person you are. So here we have Rosemary Ketchum, who is the member of the City Council of Wheeling, West Virginia, representing Ward 3. Rosemary Ketchum serves as the Chief Operations Officer of the Holistic Youth Wellness Coalition, Edible Mountain. And she is also a graduate from Wheeling University with a Bachelors of Science in Psychology. And in her work, Rosemary advocates for a range of issues, including racial justice, affordable housing, homelessness, as well as governmental transparency. And in 2020, Rosemary was awarded the Outstanding Young West Virginian Award and has since been profiled by several outlets, including The Today Show, Time Magazine, and CNN, for her work in community organizing and politics. Rosemary has also received several recognitions. For example, in 2018, she received the Community Superstar Award from the Healthy Kids and Families Coalition. Back in 2019, she was featured in West Virginia Living Magazine's Wonder Woman issue for her work in community organizing. And last year in 2020, she was awarded the Outstanding Young West Virginian Award, which I had just mentioned. And aside from her professional life, Rosemary also enjoys dancing, listening to Taylor Swift, and also drinking white wine, which is pretty cool. So Rosemary, let's start off. We want to give you a chance to tell everybody here about the experiences you faced growing up and how they all aligned you to bring you to the position that you are in today.
Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction, Nicole. I'm so grateful to be here. As Nicole mentioned, my name is Rosemary Ketchum. I am a member of the Wheeling City Council. I was elected in June of 2020, which feels like a million years ago in pandemic time, but not that long ago. I didn't always want to be a politician or an elected official. When I was a teenager, I probably didn't know very much about politics or what a politician did. But like many folks that you may ask who get into politics, there was no single event or linear, story about my path to politics. I grew up actually in Ohio, rural Ohio, to a pair of wonderful blue-collar parents. My father worked in the local factory for as long as I can remember, and my mother was a waitress on and off while I was growing up. So we were a family that didn't have a lot, but we were able to, live well, and my parents were able to, provide for me and my two younger brothers and my older sister. But I remember being a young kid and recognizing that, my gender identity did not match my biological sex growing up. So, I'm 27 years old, which feels old right now. But I was growing up in, the early 2000s. And right now we have a lot of incredible resources for LGBTQ information and rights. But in 2005, there was not as much information, and some of it was, not helpful. So I didn't know exactly what my experience would lead to, but I found myself loving, supporting my community and helping people who needed support like I felt that I needed. And I moved to Wheeling in 2010 and did a lot of community organizing around issues like racial justice, affordable health care, affordable housing, reproductive rights, and soon found myself incredibly frustrated by community organizing. I loved the work. I felt like a scrappy organizer fighting, the establishment. But I also realized that I only had so much power as an organizer. I didn't have a vote. I really didn't have a seat at the table. And I definitely did not have the ear of people who were decision makers. And so it didn't happen overnight. It took many years for me to realize that maybe the next step from community organizing should be a run for elected office. That's a lot of word salad, but I hope that's a pretty good synopsis of my path to politics.
That is literally perfect. I mean, thank you so much for sharing that story with us. I mean, it's really empowering to see how you took all of those experiences and how that led you to the position that you are in today. Because for sure, a lot of people want to get involved in politics and, working for the government and, leading the country or the community. But oftentimes because of, either the color of people's skins or their orientations, or even, because they belong to certain minority groups, it often restricts them from being able to come out there and actually give their all and show their potential to people. So I'm really grateful that, I'm really glad that you shared this story with us, because I'm pretty sure all our listeners and viewers out there who are even going to watch this recording are going to feel super empowered knowing how you took those experiences and, brought them forth to actually leading your community to, success. And that's what's really important right now. And now I'd like to give the opportunity to Jamie here to ask a question to Rosemary. So Jamie, you may go ahead.
Hi, Rosemary. Political change can be a time of hope and a time of grief for some. Were there instances in your life where the political changes negatively impacted your mental health? And if yes, how do you face those?
Great question, Jamie. I think politics can be a very toxic place where we assume or expect our politicians to be almost superhuman. And I know, just in working with other members of my city council, but also having worked on various campaigns and initiatives across the state of West Virginia, there is this assumption that if you are vulnerable or you express any kind of burnout or fatigue, then you are not ready or prepared to do the job. And that is irresponsible and inappropriate and really not helpful or productive, because, as a public servant, we are serving the public and we should represent what it looks like to take care of ourselves, to practice self-care, to prioritize our own wellness. Interestingly enough, we're seeing this take shape right now in the Tokyo Olympics with Simone Biles. It's an incredible example of what it looks like to set a boundary for yourself and say, I understand what my expectations are, but I also have a responsibility and a duty to care for myself, because ultimately I support a team. And I see that reflected in myself, in the politics that I support. It takes a lot out of you to be a community organizer and a politician, because you are now representing a community and at once, but you are also representing your own values. And it's very vulnerable to stick up for what you believe in. It's not for everybody. And with that, if you are at all self-aware or at all in tune with your own identity, you ask yourself a lot of tough questions. So one of the things that, I have a background in mental health. I've worked in mental health for many years. And with our clients, we would talk about the negative feedback loops that we all have, the things that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And if you're healthy, you have one too. And mine usually is, who do you think you are? It's this phrase that I can't help but repeat to myself whenever I want to take on something ambitious or think about doing something that's bigger than myself, or that will take a lot of, strategizing. Who do you think you are to take something like this on? You're not the smartest person in the room. You're not the most experienced. You're not the oldest. You're not the, whatever. And that is part of my own insecurity and on my mental health journey to overcome this sense of imposter syndrome. I'm not sure if folks in the room have heard of the phrase imposter syndrome before, but for anybody who's experienced success or is on this journey, you will, I think, experience a sense of imposter syndrome, this kind of feeling like a fraud, or feeling like you don't belong, or feeling like you've snuck into the party with all the cool kids and you're just, happy to be there. I've definitely felt that in my life. And I feel that, even to this day from time to time. And it's no surprise that feelings of imposter syndrome happen more often in marginalized communities, with vulnerable communities that have not historically had a seat at the table, or have historically been condescended to, patronized, demoralized, all kinds of things. So yes, Jamie, I've definitely had experiences that have tested my own mental health and my own sense of self. A couple of ways that I'm able to combat that include being radically honest with myself and saying that, maybe you aren't, prepared for this, but you can be. Preparation is not about, it's not about merit or qualification. It's about the work that you put in. And so, I tell myself that if I care enough, I am enough. That if I'm prepared, that's the best that I can do. Anxiety, it's interesting. Worrying and anxiety is just a mechanism to feel like we're in control of our environment, when in reality, we're not in control of very much at all. And so it's easier said than done, but to kind of sometimes surrender yourself to the just randomness of life is somewhat reassuring, at least for me. And that's kind of my meta existentialist behavior, just thinking that, you know what, all I can do is try my best and care for myself and set healthy boundaries. Exactly what Simone Biles is doing right now, understanding where my limits are and what I owe other people. And actually, I think we realize we don't owe other people very much at all. We owe it to ourselves to take care of ourselves and to fulfill the duties that we have, earned. I know that was a long answer, but that's some of the things and ways that I'm able to cope with some of those insecurities and feelings of imposter syndrome. But it happens to all of us differently, and all of us need different things to recharge. So those are some of the things that work for me.
Wow, I think that was beautifully said. And I'm sure there's something that all of us have to learn from it, that we owe to ourselves, and it's our duty and our responsibility at the end of the day.
I'd like to add in by saying the thing you said, that that we don't have control of every other situation we're in. I think that is something that's really important for each of us to realize, because personally, I know I have been worrying so much about these college applications, and there are so many peers of mine that are bothered about these college applications. And the fact to get into a very good school means that we have to prove our everything, and sometimes it's a very overwhelming process, because I feel that I have not done anything in these years, and I feel I'm not enough to show those schools why I fit in. But at the same time, I owe it to myself. I don't owe it to those schools, and I really need. And that's just something that I want to overcome, this feeling of trying to control everything, trying to make sure I have the top extracurriculars and I have the top marks and everything, because I know that there are certain occasions where I can't be the best at everything. I am going to fall, and there are going to be setbacks, but I just that's something I really want to empower everybody here, whoever's dealing with college applications, because I know there are a lot of people in my organization itself that have this college fever, trying to get into the best college, and the applications process can be very daunting. But Rosemary really empowered us by saying that we don't have control over everything, and we really need to just let things flow the way they are flowing. So thank you so much for that. And now I'd like to give the opportunity to Kishan to ask a question, which again revolves around the politics field. So Kishan, you may go ahead.
Hi, Rosemary. So my question is, United for Change is entirely made up of young people between the age of 14 to 18, and each of us are passionate about being activists, change makers, and leaders in our community. What advice would you give us if we wanted to get involved in the politics industry? Could you give us some tips that we youngsters could implement in order to play an active role in politics?
Great question, Kishan. Yes. So I think a lot of folks think about politics and they may only think about the people who run for office. And it's very important that we elect thoughtful and engaged people to run for office. But I don't think folks, unless they're involved, understand the entire scope and machine of politics, that there are hundreds of thousands of people that are working in politics that aren't in elected office at all. And so for me, my path included community organizing, working with community members in a grassroots way around issues that mattered to them, knocking doors, talking to voters, supporting candidates. That's a really critical and invaluable position to have in your communities, in your neighborhoods, to organize and to really inspire your neighbors. It's not always, or not typically, the politician that inspires or organizes people. It is the grassroots organizers that are doing that work. So that's a great way to get involved in politics that can often be nonpartisan. I know a lot of folks who don't identify as a Democrat or a Republican, but organize around issues, organize around values that matter to them. And I know for a lot of younger folks, they're tired of the two-party system and the back and forth and the toxicity that exists there. And they're tired of being told that it's a necessary evil. And I'm very hopeful that our two-party system will evolve into a more issues-based system. Who knows how long that'll take, but I think that we can get there with the leadership that young people are proving. So that's one way to get involved. Volunteering for campaigns is really important. I probably would never have run for office if I didn't know what it looked like under the hood. All of the kind of, as they say in politics, making the sausage, what it looks like to actually see the gears turn in a campaign. Campaigns are not sexy or glamorous. They're tough and awkward, and nobody knows what they're doing most of the time. And if you win, you mostly got lucky, and it was a great circumstance or a great series of circumstances. And if you lose, usually it's the exact same reason. So it's really, I've seen races that were almost perfect, that were incredible, and absolutely fail. So that, well, you can absolutely cut your teeth on volunteering for campaigns and be burnout. So just be careful if you go that route, to have a really great self-care routine. And then the next perhaps most popular way to be involved in politics is to run for office. And some people are not built to run for office, and then some people are really, really good and should throw their hat in the ring. And that's a really important role to play, but you have to ask yourself a lot of tough questions. Are you prepared to represent your neighborhood? Do you know your community well enough to represent them? What are your current relationships? It's really tough to run a race in a neighborhood that you're not connected with. For example, I'm not from West Virginia. I was not born in the town that I represent. I didn't go to high school with a lot of the people here. And so that was a huge obstacle I needed to overcome. So putting in that early work is really, really important if you're looking to run for office. And then the next question you have to ask yourself is, what office do I want to run for? There are plenty of different offices that are political and some that are not political in your local government that you could run for. So a lot of different questions if you want to get involved. But the most important thing is to make sure that you are translating your digital activism into grassroots activism. I think what we're seeing right now is a group of folks, regardless of age, who think that digital activism is the only way to reach people. It is an incredible way to reach people. We have never had the access that we have now, but it does not match the face-to-face, person-to-person contact that we have lost, frankly, during the pandemic, but that I think can never be matched. So building a strategy of person-to-person community building is the best way to be involved in politics, no matter what capacity you're looking for.
That was really impressive, and I'm sure that as you answered my question, most of us would want to take up your advice regarding the involvement in the politics industry.
All right, that was really a great, answer. I really learned a lot from it. Some things I've never really known of before. A lot of people really go for digital activism, and that is something that's very prevalent in our times. For the Gen Z community, we really are all about digital activism, but at the same time, I don't personally. I know there may be a range of clashing opinions, but I don't find digital activism always as effective as being a physical activist, if you guys know what I mean. So I really believe you need to go physically out there and make your mark rather than only doing it digitally. So I really agree with what Rosemary had to say, that grassroots organizing is very important as well, if you want to get involved in politics. So that was really great. So Arav, I'd like to give you now an opportunity to ask Rosemary a question. So you may go ahead.
Hi, Rosemary is somebody who wants to enter the field of politics and study political science and become an administrator someday. At the end of the day, each one of us is uniquely different in the fields that we pursue. When you entered the field of politics, even as as someone from the grassroots level, as an activist or a community organizer and builder, was there ever a time where you had trouble fitting in due to certain characteristics, features, attributes? And if you did feel so, how did you find a way to accept these differences and excel in your field, especially one where confidence is key?
Really, really good, Arav. Yes. So thank you for being interested in political science. I do not have a political science background myself. I have a public health background, but we rely on people who work in political science to help us with analyzing data and building strategies. I literally could not do my job if it weren't for people who are looking at the science of politics. So thank you for that. Yes. So by the nature of politics and being an elected official, you are a public figure and you represent a community and you represent, whether you like it or not, certain values and characteristics that, are innate to yourself. So for example, I'm 27 years old. I'm considered a young person. I'm the youngest member of our city council. And most politicians, I don't know off the top of my head what the average age of a politician is, but I'd say it's upwards of the 40s and 50s and 60s. So, representing the values of a generation of young people is really, really important and difficult. I'm having conversations about racial justice. Those are tough conversations to have with communities that have never had to talk about it before. With communities that are predominantly white, we are 90% plus white in my community. And some folks might say, well, then why do we need to have these conversations? And I would say that's exactly why we need to have these conversations, because we are not well represented racially. Those are tough conversations to have, but represent the values of the future, really, and what we expect from our communities. So that's an example of a really hard conversation to have with folks who might not identify with the Black Lives Matter movement, might not identify with progressive values, but do understand the importance of supporting our communities of color. And so for me, that's one example of being able to meet people where they are, which is sometimes a tough but really important strategy. And what I mean by meeting people where they are is not, condescending or talking down to folks, trying to listen before you lecture. And that's really hard for me because I love to speak and I love to teach and I really enjoy talking about the things that matter to me. But so many of the folks that I represent, nobody really listens to them. And so being able to hear what their concerns are, dispel some of the myths, and really at the end of the day, when, as Nicole is saying, this face-to-face, person-to-person organizing, you realize that you are on the same page 99% of the time, that people actually agree with things, like racial justice and affordable housing and reproductive health care, when it's taken out of the political partisan conversation, So, that's one example of how I'm trying to strategize around these progressive values. Another, obvious example is that I am a transgender person. And when I was elected in June of 2020, I became the first openly transgender elected official in the state of West Virginia, which I was so grateful for, but also opened up a lot of conversation with my community, folks who are not comfortable with it, folks who are adversarial against the LGBT community, and I have to understand that they're dealing with their own things, and it's kind of more representative of their own lives than anything that I have going on. But that can make it really difficult. I did not win my race by a landslide. I won my race by 15 votes, which is something I try to remind folks of. The power of a single vote is real. I try to remind folks that if I had knocked on 15 fewer doors or made 15 fewer phone calls, I probably wouldn't be here right now. But the last extra couple of folks who came out to vote for me really made the difference. So being able to overcome some of the stigma and stereotypes about what it means to be a progressive transgender politician is not easy, I'll say that, but it's possible, particularly in really rural and conservative places like West Virginia. West Virginia, for a lot of folks, does not represent progress or diversity or young thinking or fresh thinking necessarily. And some of that's validated by the politicians we have and the decisions that we've made that aren't really thoughtful. But I hope that my election is an example of actually what's possible. You can elect really thoughtful people who are progressive and forward thinking in a place that doesn't look like it's possible. So it's really important to just push back on some of those, stigmas that people might hold against you.
What you talked about representation is very important. Either you were a conservative or liberal, and the transgender in LGBT representation, even in India, as somebody who is from India, is extremely low. And the fact that progressive candidates from areas like West Virginia winning in the US is extremely, it makes me happy, and it makes me have better hopes for India as well. That was you answered the question extremely well.
Thank you, Arav.
All right, so the next.
Hi.
Sorry. Arya, you can go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Before I start, I just want to say that you're a great inspiration and thanks for being here. Okay, so now I'll ask a question. Do you think that there is an equitable representation of the LGBTQ community in politics and the government, or do you think that the American system still ought to do more work in ensuring that more individuals within the LGBTQ community are given the opportunity to play a significant role in the government in the general political arena?
So, Arya, the short answer is no. We are still working really hard to make sure that there's equal representation across the board. And yes, in political office, but maybe even more importantly, in city administrations and in state and federal government, making sure that folks feel comfortable and safe to be out in their workplaces, because honestly, I may have a vote on city council, but we have city clerks that help build our agendas. We have city administrators that make decisions about how policy is implemented. These people are really, really important. And we want to make sure that folks in our community feel represented and feel like their values and their lived experiences are reflected in the people who hold power. And we're not there yet, particularly in rural communities. We really need to do a lot of groundwork to ensure that people feel confident enough to run for office, because you can't represent a community if you don't run for office or you don't apply for these positions. So we need to create safe spaces. And one of the ways that communities can do that is by passing non-discrimination ordinances to ensure that their employees and that their community members are protected against discrimination. I'm very hopeful that at a federal level we will soon pass the Equality Act that would enshrine LGBTQ protections in the Civil Rights Act. We're not there yet. I don't know when we will get there. But in the meantime, cities like Wheeling have taken on the responsibility to say, we are going to protect our most vulnerable community members. But additionally, I think we do need greater representation of intersectional voices. So greater representation of Black trans women in elected office would be incredible. Black people in general, we do not have a single person of color on our city council. It's been many, many years since we've had a person of color on our city council, and that's something that we need to change. And there are a lot of reasons why that may be the case, but we're not at equal representation yet. And it's going to take all of us together to get there. And I'm hopeful that young folks like yourself in the States, but globally, will feel compelled to be the leaders in their communities and to run for office and to apply for these positions and to get political science degrees like Arav and so many other folks, because that is, we are building the foundations of our future right now, whether we know it or not.
Thank you.
Arya, you're
Sorry for that. Thank you for that amazing answer. Progress is always good, and I agree that more work can be done, as there is still a lot of governments that need to do more in general to achieve equality, especially when it comes to the queer community who have always fought for a seat at the table.
Exactly.
Hi, Rosemary. So my question for you is, how do you hope to see that representation of the LGBTQ community should continually evolve within the government systems?
Great question. I think First of all, we need to ensure that LGBTQ people have decision-making power in the strategies and urban planning of our neighborhoods. We right now have the opportunity, particularly with American Rescue Plan funds that the Biden administration has passed. The city of Wheeling is going to get upwards of $29.5 million. And we can do a lot of work with not just that money, but other funds to ensure that we are protecting our communities from the impacts of COVID, but additionally, I think inspiring folks to engage and lead in their communities. I think that, this past year has been an insurmountable crisis for so many of our most vulnerable community members. I'm thinking about our homeless community members in particular here in the city of Wheeling. And of course, we know statistically many LGBTQ folks experience homelessness. And so that's something we really, really need to work on and make sure that we are including those voices in the decision-making process. It's one thing to tokenize, a marginalized community and say, we're trying to do our best by them, but we cannot have conversations about them without them. And so that's easier said than done, but it's one of the most important things that local governments can do. I think a lot of folks underestimate the power of local government and the power that local government has to directly impact their communities. Our mayor can make a decision on a Monday, and by Friday, it's in place, it's being implemented. Our communities, our neighborhoods can witness this change. That's not really practical at a state or federal level. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy to really enact change. It doesn't mean it's not important, it's absolutely critical, but just the speed at which you can affect change is actually a lot greater at a local level. So if a community, as you're saying, wants to include and empower voices of the LGBT community, of communities of color, of different faith groups, we can do that as soon as possible. And there are very few excuses why it can't be done. So here in the city of Wheeling, we're having conversations about diversity and inclusion, which is a buzzword now, but something that's existed for a long time. And it's an example of us putting our money where our mouth is and having really important conversations.
That's a powerful take, and I hope what you envision for the LGBTQ community actually progresses in real life.
Thank you. Me too.
Hi again. Most of the LGBTQ elected officials are white, according to NBC Out News. I wanted to ask you, since you're a councilwoman, is there something you would aim to do to ensure that multiracial people in general who are within the LGBTQ community also get equal opportunities in politics in comparison to or like that of the white LGBTQ community?
Really, really important question. So across the board for marginalized community members, particularly LGBTQ folks, some of the most difficult obstacles for running for office include fundraising. It is found to be much more difficult for women LGBTQ candidates to fundraise, to raise money to run for office. And I'm sure there are statistics that show that it's that much more difficult for men and women of color in the LGBT community to fundraise running for office. So that's one of the most obvious examples of an obstacle that will prevent somebody from running for even filing to run for office in the first place, because they know in their hearts that it's going to be more difficult to raise money to run for office. So that's something that's a really hard conversation that we need to have at a local, state, and federal level, how we actually make our campaign finance laws more equitable and more fair across the board. I think that they are too complex, they're too archaic, and there's an argument to be made that they are indeed racist because they have not taken into account so many of the variables of running for office. So I think that campaign finance law absolutely needs to be at the forefront of the conversation about how we can include more diverse voices running for office. Secondly, I think one of the greatest obstacles is the sense of confidence, being able to feel like you're supported by your community enough to run for office. It can be very lonely. And if you don't have a community that already supports diverse voices, you will feel, I would say, incredibly lonely in that run for office. So those are two of the most important things that we can do, I think, to support people of color running for office, LGBTQ people of color running for office. And also, I think, providing just a rally of support in various, candidate training organizations that we have. There are plenty of, candidate training project initiatives across the country that focus on LGBTQ people in particular, but probably should create a greater focus on LGBTQ people of color, because ultimately, whether we like it or not, they probably have to run a different race than a white candidate. Because of the societal norms and inherent implicit bias in so many of our neighborhoods. We talk about code switching a lot in the LGBT community, but in the Black community as well. And unfortunately, I would assume that many Black candidates or candidates of color feel this pressure to code switch because of the implicit bias of various people. So that's a much larger question that I don't have the answer to, how we solve that, how we eliminate that barrier. But I think we're, by asking the question, opening up space for the answer. And so I'm very hopeful that the LGBT community that is not, doesn't always get it right. I mean, there is internalized homophobia and transphobia in the LGBT community. There's racism prevalent in the LGBT community. And before we can, be the shining light of acceptance and equality, we need to make sure that we're doing right by ourselves and the people that support us and that we support. So yes, really, really important question. Not many clear answers, but campaign finance and support systems for those candidates, really, really important.
That's great. Equality is something that I think most governments should definitely aim to achieve. And I'm glad that you think giving queer, multiracial people more opportunities to grow and also an equal fighting chance.
So I think this has been a very productive conversation as of now. I mean, there are so many things that I have learned which I hadn't known of before. And I'm very grateful, Rosemary, that you have taken the time to share all of this with us, because this is truly a learning experience for so many of us, because you're in that position where you know so much and we're still, learning so many different things. And today I have learned so many different things. It's all too much for me to take in at the moment, but for sure, I'm going to listen to the recording and grasp each and every word. So now we're going to change the mode of our conversation. We're going to move into talking about rural communities. Now, like you said, it's really important for these rural communities to push for progressive change, but that's not always the case, particularly because of the fact that, urban areas, in the urban areas, there's a higher population. Everybody's mindset has changed, because of the work culture and so many different things. And, most of us here live in, developed countries and urban areas. And that's why our mindset is so free and open, and we're ready to accept and learn the different things so openly. But that's not always the case. Like, for example, like Arav said, in India, people have not progressed yet in their mindset. There is still, homophobia that happens on a recurring basis. It's very unnatural to fall in the LGBTQ community. It's that's not just the case in India, but also in a lot of other countries. And particularly this happens in underdeveloped or developing countries where, there are so many rural areas around. And because they follow those past traditions and past values, these current things are not taken into account as seriously as they should. And Rosemary, because you have a lot of knowledge on this subject, I just wanted to ask you, why do you think that these urban and rural areas are so politically divided?
That's really important. I think you make a really great observation that our rural communities, there's a societal and cultural component to why progress so often has failed to actually take shape. And, from in the context of West Virginia in particular, there is a lot of distrust and mistrust of political systems that are validated by corruption and a lack of transparency, and bad people, just bad politicians, practicing this quid pro quo nature of politics that would cause anybody to distrust their political systems. And so that's part of it, I think. We often, whenever we are betrayed as human beings, regardless of politics, we put up a wall and we defend ourselves. And oftentimes we, I think, fall into this concept of confirmation bias, believing, things that already support our developed point of view. And, in a place like West Virginia, we have a declining population, an aging population, and a population that is made largely of people living in poverty. And so these are, people, many times no fault of their own, who are living in crisis. This kind of, as you say in psychology, this fight, flight, or freeze, where they feel a lot of anxiety about their future, and that may, compel them to do things that aren't smart, or support politicians that aren't thoughtful. And so in the city of Wheeling, for example, we have a declining population. Of course, we have an aging population. And one of the conversations that we have time and time again is, how do we pull more young people into our city? We're desperate for young folks to move to the city of Wheeling to make progress, to hold jobs, to go to school, to join various boards, committees, and commissions in our city, because ultimately it will be young people that pull us along, so that we can create progress. I don't think that, just because a person is of a certain age, that they're inherently progressive or thoughtful or forward thinking. But, it is obvious that younger folks are taking charge and taking a stand on issues that have long been a problem. For example, climate change is something that I'm thinking of. Here in the state of West Virginia, we many of the hundreds of thousands of folks who have worked for many years have worked in the energy sector, particularly in coal mining, and we know that coal mining, particularly in West Virginia, is on the steep decline, and no longer is a job that thousands and thousands of people are able to live on in the state of West Virginia. That's being outsourced. It's no longer as profitable as it once was. So many reasons. But even still, it is difficult for many folks to see an energy economy that doesn't involve non-renewable resources. Young people see that future. Young people know it's possible. But how do we bridge this cultural divide? It's a question that I don't think many people have the answer to. But I think how we start having, how we start bridging that political divide, or that generational divide, is by meeting people where they are, listening to folks, and finding that common ground. Because when you actually talk to people who support coal mining, they actually also support renewable energies. It's not a zero-sum game for them. They just feel, frankly scared of losing a livelihood and being left behind. So I think there's a lot of psychology at play in why rural communities have not been able to really break out of, a lot of the negative thought patterns that we were talking about before. But it's not a destiny. We are proving day in and day out here in the state of West Virginia that if we elect people who are forward thinking, it can really change the culture of our communities. It might not happen in our lifetime that that West Virginia becomes 100%, renewably forced. But I think we're going to get there.
That is literally such a powerful perspective. I mean, for sure, I really agree with everything you've just said right there. And I feel communication is really very important, for young people especially. It is essential to communicate your perspective and your point of view to that of, the older generation, because they're never going to know. They weren't raised in a world where the internet took over, but we were raised in such a kind of such an environment. So I feel the only way we could make use of that is by communicating with our, elders and those out there, and trying to shift them from that traditional mindset to a progressive mindset. And what you said right there, the examples that you gave about climate change, I truly agree with that. And I feel anybody listening to this will get empowered by whatever you just said. And now I want to give the opportunity to Hindara to ask a question, which again revolves around rural communities. So Hindara, you may go ahead.
Hi there, Rosemary. So my question is, do you think that the American rural population has been ignored by the urban progressive? And to give us your opinion on why rural areas should be a progressive priority.
Yes. So yes, I would say that conservative areas have often been neglected by more progressive urban areas. And as a progressive in a very urban and very rural and conservative area, I totally see that people feel left behind, that people feel that the established progressive political world not only has left them behind, but disrespects them and makes them feel like they're not part of the process. And that happens on Twitter, that happens on Facebook, but it also happens on the ground. And one example, I'll go back to a changing energy economy. We have conversations in political rooms about transition economies, making sure that we are supporting people who traditionally worked in non-renewable resources like coal, and making sure that they have the opportunity to be part of that transition. But that's a tall order to ask, somebody who's worked in coal for 30 years to go back to school and start building solar panels. It might sound like it makes sense, but I think we forget that for so many of the folks who have dedicated their lives to these professions, it's no longer just a job, but it's an identity. It is who they are, it's what they believe in, it's how they identify. So I think we're missing a really important conversation around identity and how people see themselves. And so people don't just see themselves as working a day job, they see themselves as this specific career that supports their family, that keeps the lights on. And so in that frame of mind, maybe you're not thinking about the long-term, far-reaching impacts of climate change. It's not an excuse. You should be thinking of those things, but maybe you don't have the opportunity to have that conversation or to see it in a different way. So I don't think we give our rural communities enough credit for the sacrifices they've made to keep our lights on, to build the energy infrastructure that we have today. But we've also not allowed them, in my opinion, to be part of the conversation of transitional economies. We've said, we're going to change the economy and we want you to be on board, rather than saying, we are in a transition phase right now, and you need to help us lead this transition. That's, I think, a more compelling conversation for folks who feel left behind. So that's one example in the context of our economy. But I think what's even more powerful and more difficult to answer are these cultural conversations about the divide between urban and rural. And in the context of Wheeling, Wheeling became the first city in the state of West Virginia to acknowledge racism as a public health crisis. It passed unanimously. I was very grateful, but there was backlash in our community afterward. People who didn't understand it questioned whether racism even existed in our communities. Of course, these were people who were white and typically of privilege, who perhaps have never experienced racism in their lives personally. And so I shouldn't expect them to be able to see it all of the time, because it might not be something they have personal experience with. But it is no excuse for them not to have done their own education and to ask their friends of color the racism that they've experienced or what have you. And so unless we're willing to have those tough conversations and meet people where they are, and that's really hard in cancel culture when so many people say things that are inappropriate and not correct, and sometimes downright racist and terrible. It is often our first instinct to cancel them and to eliminate them from the conversation. But whether we're listening to them or not, they're still there. They're still having conversations. They're still believing things that aren't true or that are, incredibly inappropriate. And so I think that we really need to do more work, not to just throw folks away who might not get it. And I have this conversation a lot about people who are bigoted versus people who are ignorant. And bigoted people, they're going to be racist and homophobic and transphobic, and they're going to enjoy it. And there isn't a whole lot we can do beyond, their own lived experience. Maybe something will change in them. But then there are more people, I would argue, who are ignorant, who really don't see racism. And so they don't feel like it exists and they don't feel that this work is necessary. But if we were able to have conversations with them, talk about lived experience, expose the inherent institutional and systemic racism that exists, then maybe that they can be enlightened and say, oh my goodness, I had no idea that this was here. And that's the same conversation with LGBTQ issues and the pay gap and climate change and all of these other things we're talking about. It's really hard work. It will not happen overnight. It won't even happen in a single generation. But I think that reminds us that we need to be patient and that we need to persevere, because if we don't do it, nobody else will. And that's why I'm grateful for all the work that you're doing. So great question, Hindara.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. I think coming from a small country of Indonesia, like there's a lot of rural areas, I feel like sometimes we felt left behind, but really though, it's a really great explanation. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to give the opportunity to Anissa to ask the last and final question to Rosemary. So Anissa, you may go ahead.
Hi, Rosemary. So I really want to ask you about this. What has been the highlight of your life in 2021, and what's one thing that you want to accomplish before 2022 begins?
Big question, Anissa. Yes, so 2021 has flown by already. We are already in August, but we have been working really hard in the city of Wheeling to fix some things that really need our support. First, a really not interesting or sexy issue is fixing our water and sewer systems. We have some of the oldest water and sewer infrastructure anywhere in the country. And in the American Rescue Plan, the Biden administration outlined a couple parameters for how we can spend this money. And a huge portion of those parameters involved water and sewer infrastructure. So that's one of the things that we're excited to be working on, that residents don't really love because we have to tear up our streets and do some not great things. But it's really important for the work to be done. One of the things that I'm really proud about that just recently happened, the city of Wheeling is experiencing a great proportion of chronic homelessness. And it is something that has been compounded by the global pandemic. Many of the resources and spaces that our homeless community previously occupied are no longer available, that are closed. Even today, when we are, no longer wearing masks to some extent, we just had a, reinstatement of the mask mandate nationwide. So we'll see how that, pans out. But our homeless community is still vulnerable and literally outside in tents. So I took a proposal to City Council for us, the city, to hire a homeless liaison coordinator, somebody to work with our homeless community to create a pathway to housing and to address so many of the other issues that they experience, including addiction, which is an enormous component to the homeless experience, mental illness, which is a really important intersection there, and trauma, which is something that I think we've all experienced. Trauma, there is no one picture of trauma, but it's something that our homeless community members are experiencing every day. So that, I think, for right now is something I'm most proud of. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve the issue, but it's a really important first step. Looking forward to 2022, There are so many things that I'm excited to do. We are working on legislation to pass the Crown Act, which is an act that has been passed really in many communities nationwide to prevent discrimination based on natural hair. So many of our incredible employees, both in the city of Wheeling and statewide, deserve to be protected, deserve for their protective and natural hairstyles to be protected. We should not criminalize people for the way their hair naturally grows out of their scalp. That makes no sense. And as part of dismantling this institutional racism that we may be blind to, a lot of people who are well-meaning may not even see that that is a problem, or that that kind of legislation or discrimination would be problematic. So that's something I'm really excited to work on. And then decriminalizing cannabis in the city of Wheeling. It's something that I spoke about while running for office. It's not an easy conversation to have with a lot of folks, but it's something that matters to me, particularly when we talk about a transitional economy, ensuring that we are able to earn eventually the tax dollars if we're able to pass this at a state and federal level, because people are smoking marijuana, and we want to make sure that if they are, it can happen safely and without the criminalization that we know so often happens disproportionately to our Black and Brown communities. So those are a couple of things that I'm excited to work on, in addition to all of the infrastructure and other needs that we have here in the city. Great question, Anissa.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. You're so awesome.
Oh, love you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. You literally empowered us and inspired us with all that you have to say. This entire conversation was so much fun. It was packed with so much of things I hadn't learned of before. And I'm so grateful that you took the time out of your busy schedule to grace us with, so many different aspects of what our communities go through. And I'm really grateful for your presence here at our talk show, because this talk show is all about having conversations and making sure that voices like yours are heard, and that we can bridge all those different gaps that our society faces. So once again, I want to thank you immensely from the bottom of my heart, because it was amazing having you today. I'm literally left speechless.
You're too sweet, Nicole. The questions that everyone had were so incredible. I have not had this much fun in a long time. So anything that I can do to help in the future, just let me know.
Of course, for sure. And all the best to all of your endeavors that you want to take on for the future. And I hope and I pray that they will be successful and they will lead to a better community for the entire country, not just Virginia, West Virginia, but I hope it impacts the entire country, USA as a whole.
So, thank you, Nicole.
No worries. So thank you so much, Rosemary, for coming on here. It was amazing having you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.